All right, how many of you remembered that it's Towel Day? Wave it. All right. In honor of the late Douglas Adams, who fought very hard for a lot of the things that we're talking about here. It's in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, always know where your towel is. And this happens to be the Towel Day, not for another century, 5/12, 5/21, 22,
25.
12. Well, in any event, it adds up to 42, my wife pointed out to me. Well, we're here today to do the futurist section that just comes before the great master futurist comes on. And we're here to talk to my bro and pal, Kim Stanley Robinson. We actually were in grad school together, very different departments. But at UCSD, back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's happening at UCSD shortly. But Stan is an example of this anomaly that just terrifies me, and George Dyson was an example of this. I worked hard to get my union card as a physicist and a scientist, and so I can do the hard science fiction. Stan and Greg Bear and a couple of others were freaking English majors. And yet they do the hard stuff as well as anybody, better than almost anybody. They simply learned that what you can do is bribe experts with pizza and beer. It's the cheapest consulting fee possible, and they will fall over themselves. And if you need to pay more than pizza and beer, you name a character after them.
Even just a phone call will do it.
That's right. Well, I try to name some after them. They've got people who are really, really helpful to me. I give them live sex on stage in the book. Not in real life. Stan lives in Davis, California, with his wife, a scientist. I married a scientist as well. And two very successful young sons, and they live in what I call Hobbitown. All the streets in this ecological village are named after places and characters in Tolkien. So, in any event, Stan, I was very moved by George Dyson, well, Amory Lovins, of course, and by George Dyson's call for industrialists to consult historians more. And at that point, I said, you know, what are we, chopped liver? We turn things around a little and look ahead.
Well, science fiction is a historical literature. It's scenario building, and it's very similar to what everybody does when they build their project, because your project is necessarily projected into the future. So what science fiction writers do is not greatly dissimilar from anybody doing their planning for their life or their company. So there are no deep secrets involved except to make up a story that people can follow and be entertained by. And science fiction writers, some of them are forgotten. Edward Bellamy, looking backwards to the year 2000, from the year 2000, this is a huge impact on the American progressive politics a century ago. So a big, real impact in the real world. Same with H.G. Wells, who through his utopian novels has had an ongoing effect on the World War II generation, so that when they reconstructed the world in 1945 as a political, social, and economic order, they were consciously or unconsciously influenced by H.G. Wells, who's better remembered for his science fiction novels per se. So it's a part of it's a tool of human thought. You know, it's entertaining but useful.
And you have to mix. You have to do that mix. You have to after you've explored an idea for several pages, blow something up.
Well, yeah, it's the car chases. I've been trying to figure out how to make those combinations work, and that's probably the ongoing issue of being a science fiction writer. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, George talked about how historians. Well, you just described, I think, the essence that science fiction was probably badly named.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. Science fiction is a great name, a powerful name, because science is really the process of looking for facts and trying to figure out the world as it is, and fiction is really our repository of values, our creator of values. So you say science fiction, you're really saying fact values, and this is a strange juxtaposition, because we usually think of facts and values as having a dichotomy that can't be bridged. It's even a famous problem in philosophy. So to make the claim science fiction, first of all, science is so immensely powerful in the world that you're making a claim to that kind of power. And then secondly, you're saying that you can talk about the values that science might bring into being. So there's no better name for it, really. I mean, you could
speculative history?
No.
Because that's extending the drama from the past into alternate histories.
First of all, we're stuck with it, the name science fiction, and secondly, and so when you try to make up speculative fiction, speculative this and that, it's an attempt for literary respectability. You're trying to dodge what you really are. It's caving into a kind of prejudice.
So says the PhD in English.
Well, that's right, and I don't like being condescended to when I'm doing something as cool as science fiction. So it is what it is. It's science fiction.
Well, that's fabulous, and I can't disagree with that. I'm looking at your novel, your wonderful tome here, 2312, and I must say, it didn't occur to me at first that it was designed to be 300 years in the future. Instead, what occurred to me is that for the last several centuries, the century seemed to begin about the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th year. World War I during the 20th century, the end of the Napoleonic and Revolutionary era in the 18th century, and then 19th century, and then I remembered that Robert Heinlein predicted that in 2012 America would elect a fundamentalist preacher who became prophet of the Lord, Nehemiah Scudder. So were you thinking at all about this business that the century starts a little bit delayed?
No, I think, periodization is just something that we do, and the numbers cut across it strangely and arbitrarily. I was thinking 300 years out, because that's so far out that imagining it is simply mind-boggling and beyond what anybody can do, including me. So in attempting it, and trying also to provide a realistic or plausible-seeming history between now and then, it's very deep waters and about as far as I can venture. And you go farther and you get into space opera, which is a beautiful subgenre of its own, but detached from history per se, because it's so far in the future you could say anything. But in this case, I tried to actually give a backstory or a plausible history for the next 300 years, and that's hard.
There's, I often think that there are three different time phases in science fictional extrapolations, and I liked what you said about how science is the driver of change. I think that the real definition of our genre is that it's the literature that deals with the human response to change, and change is the one constant, well, the acceleration of change is the one constant of our era. But these time periods would be the very near future, which you've just spent a trilogy dealing with the very near future and the political processes. Your Washington trilogy, dealing with the political processes, the social processes that are involved in humanity trying to get around the pitfalls, the mistakes that maybe have tripped up all the other species in our galaxy, explaining the great silence out there. Would you like to, do you feel that trilogy worked out well?
Well, there is, I agree with you, science fiction has what you could call near future or day after tomorrow, where, and the important thing there is never to put a date on it and to write about things that are happening right now and things that might be happening 20 or even 50 years from now and mix them in a melange, and that's the feeling of the present. So that near future science fiction is simply the best realism of our time, because that's how now feels. Then there's the middle distance, and then the far distance would be space opera. The middle distance doesn't have quite a name, but I call it future history, because you can still do this historical simulation and talk about, where we might get in a few centuries, the potentialities, the dangers, the bizarre combination of the technological opportunities that are offered by the work being done in this room and elsewhere to make a superb human civilization, but the problems of the dangers of the planetary resources and the various kind of overshoots that we're doing that endanger that project, and both of them happening at once in such ferocious high speeds that it's hard to sort out and interesting to contemplate. Try to de-strand it, talk about positive strands, talk about dangers at the same time. And basically these novels like this are complicated questions. What they're asking is, could this happen? Could we have environmental disaster and technological progress at the same time? And if the answer kind of instinctively is, well, no, then that's troublesome, because really that's where we're at right now. That's the basis on which we're working right now. And if you answer, well, no, those two can't exist at the same time, then you have to look at the world we're in right now and think, well, wait, we've got a problem. And we do.
Yeah, but do you think we're in a bridge period, a period of unusual, or is that temporal chauvinism to say that the next 50 years are going to be crucial for the next 1,000, the decisions made?
It does look like a choke point, and that may be just the perspective that it always looks like that. But nevertheless, there are so many systems that could crash, and we don't have good food reserves. We have a fairly grotesque human inequity on the planet, the gaps between rich and poor, and economic system that doesn't properly address that. So that the dangers seem high of crashing the system before the technological utopia can be fully enacted. So,
and yet what makes this wonderfully tense, what makes our time very much like a tense novel, is the positive trends, like Daniel Pinker's talking about the decline of violence and the increase in the ratio of human children who have opportunity.
Yes, this is a
and
very
the declining
important
population growth rate. These are all crossing these
yes.
crises.
It's important not to be apocalyptic or to say, oh, we're doomed, because there are these positive trends, and public health, public safety, and our medical situation are all trending so positively that the realistic imagination of a truly sustainable and decent human civilization is not a utopian or far-fetched statement. You can see it as a possibility, but the dangers are equally as great, and so it is a strange moment to try to contemplate and to build scenarios forward from, because they tend to tip as if we're on a very narrow peninsula, and on one side we drop off quickly to disasters that might be really shattering to the civilization, because it is a global civilization right now. On the other side, various kind of slower and more gradual movement into positive futures of one sort or another that are quite exciting.
Well, yeah, what makes it very tense and movie-like today is that if we fail, we'll just barely fail. And if we make it, we'll make it by the skin of our teeth, don't you think?
Yes, I think that puts it well. That's the peninsula is rather narrow, and the drop-offs on each side are rather steep, so that I think there was an assumption that history would just go forward, we'd keep muddling on, and some things would be good, some things would be bad, but would be muddling forward in a kind of generally progressive manner.
Which is why your fiction has a tendency to be very propelled by passion about our times, about the problems in our times.
Well, this is the novel. I mean, the novel is supposed to be. It's not just scenario building, but the actual questions of what a novel does. And
well, tell us about your thoughts about sustainability.
Well, what I'm interested in, and especially in a group like this, is this notion that we could use technology to work things for the better, not just in what is commonly thought of as technology, because I want to think about writing as a technology, language as a technology, and justice as a technology, in the sense that there's software for computers. There are these systems for human beings getting along, and so if you think of justice as a technology that is applied, then that also brings in economics as a technology, so that what I'd love to see is your CTO challenge being applied to making up not a new economic system, because that would be too abstract and not applicable to the situation that we're in, because we have path dependency, we have a legal system that is now global in place that cannot just be thrown aside and replaced outright, and it would be disaster to try. So what you need is incremental change, you need reform, you need tweakings of the system that are sort of like what technology does, and it has very much to do with what Amory Lovins was talking about earlier today, something that's trans-ideological and yet still leads towards better futures. So that, you had Bill Janeway here and you have Amory Lovins here. It would be really interesting to have a CTO group get together and talk about how could economics do a better job if you agree that we have systemic predatory dumping. In other words, that we're constantly selling things for less than they really cost to make because we are deferring so many costs onto the future, so that the system itself is involved in predatory dumping.
And socialization of costs while privatization of benefits.
Exactly, and the people we're predating on, if you think of it as predatory dumping, are the future generations. So they're not really here to fight back. They're easy opponents to whip because they're non-existent at this point. And so the shifting around of economics would be, it'd be interesting to see if you could properly cost things. Well, another thing that I'm interested in is this notion of shareholder value as being the only determinant of how a corporation is doing, and the stock valuation that is part of shareholder value as being the only determinant. And what's interesting is that people like Shyam Sundar at Yale or Lynn Stout up at UCLA are looking into different metrics to judge corporations by, where it becomes the stakeholders are also measured and part of as important as the shareholders. So you get the vendors, the customers, the government, the planet as equally important as shareholders in how a corporation's doing. And immediately, as economists, you say, but wait, we don't have ways to measure those other qualities. But the GDP, the gross domestic product, gross national product, that was an invention of economists in the 20s who thought it would be a useful thing to have to rate how economies were doing. So, in other words, metrics have been invented in the past and have become incredibly useful and sort of taken for granted. Like, of course there's GDP, but there wasn't in 1920. So now thinking about, well, how can we do a better metric to whether we're building towards sustainability or whether we are in big trouble, it would be useful it would be a technology and a technological question that has to do with information tech to build these kind of things up.
Well, I would love to see next to the national debt clock, which was a brilliant piece of polemic, but also malevolent, I'd like to see another national debt clock that would simply show what the public debt would be if the United States government had charged just a simple 5% royalty on jet airplanes, rockets, satellites, pharmaceuticals, the internet, telecom, and so on, whether that clock would have run backwards by now.
Well, it's very useful to think of the economics as simply legal analysis, that it's not physics, that it's not nature, but our legal system being analyzed. And economics per se, like as a science fiction writer, I'm often looking for what's the next economic system. But if you go to economics itself, what you find is that it's always reality-based and it's analyzing a system already in place. So you don't get projective economics, you don't get speculative economics, and you sometimes get completely new utopian alternative economics, but those can't be grafted into the system that we have now, so that they might be interested and they might be not,
so
but they're entirely hypothetical.
You consider yourself to be a laboratory, Gedanken experiment, thought experiment, guy working out potential models for post-capitalism?
Sure, but as a science fiction writer, and as an English major and not an economist, what I do is try to rely on the experts in these fields. So, I mean, when I talked to this group 5 years ago, I didn't know who I was talking to because I had been invited and I didn't know the context. Now that I know the context, I hardly know what to say to a group of experts who knows more about all of these topics than I do. So all I can bring to it is that perspective of the storyteller trying to build thought experiments, but what I need is the raw material, because it's not a matter of, really most novel writing is not a matter of creativity leaping out of the head of some brilliant artist, and the writers who think that way are writing trivial and uninteresting art. What an artist really is a kind of a sensitive receiver of the world pouring in, and then just try to organize it well enough to tell a story that's of interest to the people who really know what's going on. That's hard, but if you take that as the project, it can be interesting. So that in a context like this, I'm better off learning. There's more for me to learn than for me to teach, because the telling of science fiction stories is not really what everybody needs to do.
And as George Tyson pointed out, when you invite either historians like him or future historians like us to give your corporate consult, we're going to spend 2/3 of the time picking your brains because we want the things that is our real bread and butter and our real fee is, ooh, that's cool. Now, can I throw this into a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment? I thought I'd mention, since we're both from UCSD, the interesting news that both of us helped Professor Sheldon Brown organize a project at UCSD that has been signed on to by every single dean and every department chair. It's a very unique place, UCSD, a center of cross-discipline, and we've just won the right to set up the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. And it's going to bring in the neurosciences, all the scientific elements that are there, but concentrating on the notion of studying what imagination is and how to get the positive sum game of both spurring imagination more and freeing it up more while also making it more disciplined and productive of realistically useful ideas. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that, and also how in general do you think that science fiction and imagination apply to the moving into the future that these very forward-looking business people want to do?
Well, the Clarke Center is going to be great. It's the really Arthur Clarke's estate, the foundation that was set up in his memory, and using his estate is going to put their home base at UCSD. Will be good for them because UCSD is already one of the great power centers for this kind of innovation and thinking. And indeed, when they put out a request for proposals that they wanted to study the human imagination, they didn't even know what they were talking about. And when they came to UCSD with this very fuzzy RFP, I think they were completely blown away that there were people at UCSD in the neurosciences that were already doing it so much more specifically, and you might say neurologically, than they had imagined, that they just simply made the right decision to jump on into the game and provide their help and Arthur Clarke's name. So that should be a good thing.
I have sad news about that. Most of Arthur Clarke's money went to his local village in Sri Lanka.
Well,
but we did get the name, and now comes the fundraising.
Everything helps, but I think there will be some synergies involved, and Arthur Clarke's name will be part of that.
But back to the general question, how do you think that imagination and science fiction can serve these future makers and civilization as a whole?
Well, it's a larger question of the sciences and the humanities, so that if the sciences find out what nature is and how it works, and then begins to explore what we could do with it, there are technological opportunities of all kinds, but I think science, what I see happening is that science very specifically at that moment looks to the humanities as being the proper place to speak to values and to what we should try for and why we should do things. So at that point, the dialogue becomes very intense because the efforts of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are going to be directed. They're going to be directed in one way or another. And it is not specifically short-term profits which can be manipulated, but rather long-term values that will be guiding the process. So science fiction is this scenario game, and it has its entertainment value and its speculative value, but it's a larger question of the sciences and the humanities. And I want to repeat, we're on a planet where there's going to be, I mean, this is another science fiction statement, but there's going to be 9 to 10 billion people on the planet in 50 years or so. This is UN demographics, and it is very speculative, but it's as good as they can do, and it's pretty sure that we'll hit the lowest numbers of 8 or 9 billion before we stabilize, and that's a lot of people. And if all of them were to live at the Western levels of consumption, American levels of consumption, then you would need something like 3 to 6 Earths to support them, just physically, the natural resources. So that's impossible. We don't have 3 to 6 Earths to do that. And so what can't happen won't happen. And so that is not what's going to happen. There aren't going to be 8, 9 billion people living at Western consumption levels. But the IPAT formula tells us that consumption levels are a function of population times appetite or consumption times technology. So that if you get clean tech, if you get consumption levels that are lower because people have more interesting things to do outdoors where it's a low carbon burn than indoors, et cetera, then the population number is not the crucial one. So that if you multiply 10 billion people times one environmental impact unit, then you get 10 billion impact units. If you multiply that by 30, which is the differential between American consumption and developing world's Indian peasant consumption, then you get 300 billion impact units. So the power of technology, of clean tech, of consumption levels being reduced to something like what Amory Lovins does at his house, or the 2,000 Watt Society is doing in Basel and Zurich, where they've decided that if you divide the amount of available energy today by the number of people on Earth, that everybody should be burning about 2,000 watts a year, and they're perfectly comfortable in proving that the extra energy burn, the extra carbon burn that we make is mostly waste. It's simply wasted. So these are the parameters, or the world that we're in, where the questions about what should tech do should not be just limited to the latest in IT developments, iPad versus smartphones versus something in between, but should actually be thinking also about, can these iPhones, and they can, serve to educate uneducated people in the developing world, serve to leverage women's rights everywhere so that we have less population growth, because as soon as you get women's rights, you get a population replacement rate of 1.8 to 2.2 kids per mom, whereas when you have uneducated and unempowered populations, then you get levels of 5, 6, 7, 8 kids per mom, and once again you have this horrible problem. So the educational possibilities, the possibility of social justice is a technology, and this is the thing that I think is commonly misunderstood. And just in pure business terms, what you want is a world population where people feel confident and secure to consume the products that will give them their full human potential. So I feel that this gathering is a kind of utopian gathering, saying that human potential, given the boost of science and technology, is simply enormous. But what you need is a stable world population in a stable world environment to make it all work. And so it's all part of one project.
That's terrific. Well, I was going to get into the whole range from Google Glasses being the near-term implementation of augmented reality, all the way to the fact that you dance around the elephant in the room in science fiction, which is this singularity. But I think we have time for one question. Is anybody eager? Well, then you dance around on the last.
I can say in the 20 seconds that I have, I don't believe in the singularity. It's a misunderstanding of computers and of the human brain. Our control over our machinery is complete, and even if we manage to create a very good artificial intelligence, we're still going to be calling the shots, and that the singularity is an MIT promotional piece of nonsense.
Okay, But in 2312, he shows artificial intelligence sort of dancing this negotiation with us.
It's going to be hard to tell. The Turing test is going to be hard. You're going to have to be. It's not that the answers are going to have to be good, but the questions are going to have to be good. So the Turing test might be failed by us, but the computers will still be computers.
And that brings us to the basic fundamental question of science fiction, and that is, ask the right questions, or just keep asking questions.
Could I just make one point from your remarks on economics? Were you aware that the reason that God created economics was in order to give credibility to astrology?
Well, thank you, Kim Stanley Robinson.
The dismal science is still a science that we need to apply.
Right.
Thank you.